had seen domestically for quite a while and people who worked in solar. But in the kind of mainstream industrial policy world, it really came through when people started looking at electric vehicles and batteries and realized really in the aftermath of COVID, because countries were looking, and the G20 was looking at resilience and supply chains and areas that actually the vast majority of global supply chains of most of the new technologies were concentrated in China, which was not an accident because China had a whole industrial strategy around building a presence in areas with not much competition, of which all the green industries were part of that industrial strategy. And so we've seen the kind of G20 response to that as a set of economies and also as a collective, really with the US's Inflation Reduction Act, which came through and has really turbocharged, driven by, again, that mixture of economics, geopolitics, security, a real set of investments, which we expect to carry on even with the change of president, at least at some level. But that really created a ripple effect globally. Even though Europe has said it had an industrial strategy around green, and it certainly had economic recovery strategies around green after COVID, it really hadn't gripped it as an industrial policy issue. But then the reaction to IRA, more so than China, though now I think it's both directions, it's driven Europe to create an industrial strategy. And so it's quickly followed by Japan and rather belatedly, to be honest, by the UK as one of the major economies, where we're seeing a whole set of new instruments, subsidies, R&D, market creation instruments moved into place. And that's really a double-edged sword for climate change. Because on one hand, it has accelerated investment and climate action. We're now at like $1.4 trillion, and there's another tripling of that if we're to get anywhere near that, even that 1.9 degrees. So that's a huge market out there, and it's moving. But because it's the countries with deep pockets who are doing this, most of that is focused in the OECD and China. So outside there, we're only seeing 12% of global investment in clean and 1% in LDCs. So we're in this situation where we've moved from a climate problem that perhaps wasn't driving enough action to an industrial policy issue that's been driving a huge amount of action in some places. But actually a realization, this is part of the G20 discussion, that having a totally unbalanced green development globally is not going to meet our overall goals. And I think that's where we've really seen the discussions at the G20 and other fora over the last few years try and grip that. And that's driven by two things. Part of it is self-serving, in the fact that countries need other countries to provide minerals and supplies and a big open supply chain if they're going to decarbonize and diversify their supply chains, increase economic security, but also an understanding that if countries don't feel they're going to get a slice of the green pie, they're just not going to accelerate their transition. And that's particularly true for those middle-income economies like Indonesia and South Africa, who are industrializing but have no ability to compete with subsidies and don't have large market sizes to attract investment purely on their own consumption. So the idea that this is both economically unsustainable to have such unbalanced development and a kind of industrial policy war just between the major powers, and it wasn't sustainable for climate action, it wasn't incentivized what we want, has really led to a whole set of initiatives. Starting with bilateral ones where countries are doing their own, so the Global Gateway in the European Union, which is working in countries like Niger and Chile on issues like green hydrogen and critical minerals. The Green BRI is a kind of recasting of Chinese outward investment, very much focusing on manufacturing. So we're seeing Thailand, Indonesia and others getting large investments in car factories and battery factories. The US has done some areas in critical minerals, but perhaps a bit more constrained by Congress, and will be even more constrained by Congress, and there's other initiatives. But perhaps more interestingly is the G20 is really focused on international finance reform. So the basic thing is, why aren't countries able to actually take part in this economy? Because for broader macroeconomic reasons, it's really hard to get affordable financing. So a big set of reforms at the World Bank and elsewhere has released at the moment around 250 billion extra investment, and we hope to increase that by doubling and trebling over the next few years. And that will be disproportionately focused on middle income and low income countries. And to make sure everybody gets that, there's the idea of building new types of country platforms, so new types of cooperation agreement between multilateral development banks, countries, recipients. And Brazil obviously launched theirs at the annual meetings in the World Bank, and that was very interesting. Their country platform was very focused on the bioeconomy and investments in aviation, sustainable aviation fuel, in agroforestry. So essentially they've taken that concept, which was started off as kind of a energy transition focus, and turned it into a cooperative platform to fuel their industrial strategy focused around their elements which are critical to their decarbonisation. And now we're seeing that expand. We've got places like Morocco, South Africa, Indonesia, Colombia doing similar processes, similar platforms. Colombia's in the middle of developing theirs at the moment as they move away from oil and gas. And we're seeing new instruments, like Europe's just announced a new climate and trade initiative to balance out CBAM, so the carrot as well as the stick. So we'll see what's in that box, but that's meant to provide a kind of ability for countries to respond to climate border adjustments. So I think that's where, so the G20, as we move into the NDCs, it's very clear that the motivation driving countries is very much to position them in the new economy, and the NDCs are kind of part of that process, but actually the industrial strategy is what's driving it. But it's very much connected to these broader G20 discussions, which we hope to see carry on next year on financial reform, trade reform and partnerships, which would really change the way countries cooperate so that everybody gets a reasonably fair, I wouldn't say completely fair, say in building these new global markets.
That's incredibly helpful. Thanks very much, Nick. And actually, the reason that we organized this event today, focusing on net zero and industrial policy, was because trade is back in the room. We know from the discussions yesterday that one of the reasons why the adoption of the overall conference agenda took so long was because regions like the Africa Group want trade to be included in the discussions from now on. So on that note, I'm going to bring in Vivian. Vivian, you've been listening patiently. You are also an expert on net zero and industrial strategies. We thought you could help us understand better which countries are doing well on this. Where's the best practice, better practice coming out from? So over to you, please.
Thanks so much, Malini. And, great speaking with you all. I apologize that I'm speaking from Singapore. So thanks very much to Nick for kicking off. I would like to first start by, recognizing the effort of everyone in bringing to fruition the 6.4 methodology and standards confirmation yesterday. So great start to the COP. And also, I guess, given that in a way we are where we are, similar to the Marrakesh COP back with the first Trump presidency. So let me just address that, because that will be obviously significant to any net zero goal and industrial policy collaboration going forward. And obviously everyone has been making adjustments in advance. So the US IRA and the effects and implications of that on the G20 and the entire world. So given that the so-called red states, the Republican leading states, actually benefit significantly, from IRA subsidies, including solar farms in Texas and whatnot. So some of the key policies, like the IRA, will continue. So the implications of that and the geopolitical repercussions on G20 and global policy, global governmental policy going forward, would continue in large part. However, the new Trump presidency is also going to be significantly different if you have been following the various appointments already. So with that backdrop, looking at the G20 where it stands today, right? So we're talking about more than 2/3 of global GDP. I think we all know that it's a significant group. Now, as to the standards of net zero policy and who's best in class, obviously there are absolute standards that we can look at. Who has 2050 goals? Who's on track to meeting 2050 goals? My apologies. Who has 2050 as their net zero essentially deadline, and who has later deadlines like 2060 or even 2070? However, obviously every country has different capacities, different starting points. So while we take reference from global standards, and in an ideal world, obviously we want everyone to reach net zero ASAP. And there are countries that have 2040 as their goal. That is not to say that countries that have 2060 or 2070 as their net zero goals are laggards, because some of them, not all, have to move much, have to commit larger resources, or have, other key considerations. So we need to proceed on a two-track path in a way, optimizing every country has to move as quickly as possible and to be nimble in taking advantage of one, proven new technology, but a large part of it, if you look at, how battery prices have fallen, how certain countries have very effectively leveraged, for instance, Indonesia, its nickel positioning to essentially advance the state of EVs in their countries, EV adoption in their countries. And given that, that has also, for instance, tilted the balance of Korean EVs versus China-made EVs in Indonesia, right? So that, I think, is one example of essentially very intelligent industrial policy on the part of a G20 country, or on the part of a G20 government, in both meeting net zero goals and strategically advancing its sovereign objectives. So I think there was a comment earlier that sounded like countries are conceptualizing their industrial policies with the net zero goals as their primary goal. And as someone who has dedicated her life to advancing systems change to so that we have, a great future in a climate change world, climate mitigation is key. I think we also want to be pragmatic that many countries, and possibly most countries, and in a way some of the pivotal ones, have GDP, have industrial policy as their primary goal, and net zero as, with apologies, but with net zero as secondary. And so while we have seen that some very, progressive leading countries have net zero goals as their top priority, I think we need to advance global collaboration and discussions with an understanding that governments have different priorities. And I think we have also seen over the past decade that governmental policies that are not cognizant of the middle class or the poor, whichever is the largest, most pivotal voting segment in the respective countries. If countries fail to take them along, that certainly has long-term implications on stability, and hence it does not, in fact, make for sustainable net zero policy. And sometimes you have a little space, but very often in the short term and medium term, you have to negotiate a balance, which is very difficult to achieve. And this is where, international collaboration is key in removing bottlenecks, whether it's capital, whether it's the say non-aligned carbon prices, for instance, right? And I think again we have seen countries respond to the EU CBAM in a way that is logical, and I think helpful to our global net zero goals as well as their own country goals. So the EU's key leadership, and also China's for that matter, I think it's very often neglected in global discussions, and possibly more so going forward. So China's stock exchanges have actually, in a way, put forth the same or similar, let's not say use the word same, very similar regulations on their top public companies as the EU, with respect to net zero reporting and responsibilities. So these are significant economies. I think we have to look at who's driving this from Trump's side. But let's not forget that the Trump is also the one who wanted to buy Greenland. And there's really only one reason that he wanted or possibly still is interested. And that's not to say that Greenland is up for sale. It's just recognizing the fact that he did try to. Greenland is obviously, an independent state. So all that is to say that we have to both proceed with carrots and with sticks. The role of governmental policy has been key in advancing net zero. I think there's a lot of room, frankly, to both advance net zero, even within current standards, and with higher integrity of governmental policies, the standards of governmental policies, for instance, carbon markets. And it would be wise for governments to assess the state of what is best done for net zero, and also with respect to their sovereign goals. There are countries that have, already led with best practice examples.
So, Vivian, can you hear me? Yes? Great.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
so I'm going to move the discussion on. You made the important points about net zero not necessarily being the driving policy for industrial strategies. And you gave the example of countries like South Africa, who are doing it very intelligently with regard to exports, seeking export dominance in their own regions. I'd like to bring in, and the third point, of course, that you made was about securing a public mandate. Without the public mandate for these transition strategies, there isn't, they don't really have a hope in hell of succeeding. And we need them to succeed.
Not quite my words, but
no,
yes.
quite indeed. So to paraphrase, I'd like to bring in Takashi Hongo, please. So Takashi-san has been a good friend of Globe for many, many years, but also an important strategist to mid-tier global strategies. And of course, Japan has a new government now. Japan is one of the almost 70 countries in the world who has gone to the polls. And you've come straight from there and been following the discussions in terms of what is the new government's, what's going to be driving the new government's policies, and is it the search for accomplishment of net zero goals, but importantly, the drive towards a clean economy where Japan will be dominant. So your insights, please, Takashi.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm working in industry, and I'm working for the industry by providing advice on strategy. And in addition to the advice to the corporate, I provide advice on the policy side. So yesterday at the plenary, and the corporate presidency said, now we are implementation phase. That means very important for the industry. So for industry, how to remove the externality. So from that point of view, policy, that is very important. So continuity of policy and the signal of policy is very important. Last month, the unexpected thing would happen in Japan. So then the prime minister suddenly retired from the position of prime minister. So general elections are there. So the reason why then the prime minister retired is a kind of scandal. So the outcome of the general election was not so good for ruling parties. So ruling party promoted green transformation strategy. That is in line with business group's expectation. So a kind of a balance between the climate change action and business. Or other words, through the business, how to achieve the net zero emission goal. That is a really important thing. So the last month, the election result, for the ruling party losing a big seat. How that mean they are changing to the minority, the ruling party. So it's not easy to administrate the current policy. However, one party, not a big one, it's a Democratic Party for People. This is not a communist party. It's rather the right-wing side party. So they participated decision of the ruling party's proposal. It's a case by case and policy by policy. So generally speaking, their policy is very close to the ruling parties. So from technology side, the CCS, carbon capture and storage, is necessary. Nuclear, to some extent, is necessary. So I think that party can have an alliance with the ruling party. Of course, as I mentioned, case by case. So for industry side, this is really a good signal. So the continuity of the policy, that is really important. So the business group, they think about the uncertainty about the policy, not in Japan. It's a global policy, particularly the United States. What kind of impact of the change of the administration of the United States on the global framework for climate change? So they're really concerned about it. But I think the Japanese industry, most of the industry are keeping their strategy, and the implementation of their strategy already decided. So the keyword is net zero. So that means a kind of negative emission in the future is necessary. And also, the transition speed is different from country to country. So how to collaborate with other country, and how to realize, how to push the new technology. Also the technology innovation, big market is good for technology innovation. How to collaborate with other countries. That is a key point of the Japanese policy and the Japanese industry. As referred to the Asian situation, Japan proposed Asia Net Zero Emission Community, AZEC. So this is I myself have been involved in this strategy to some extent, but this is a really important thing, because one of the feature of the AZEC policy is goal is the same. All country, all company have a same goal. However, approach may be different country to country and company to company. So how to collaborate with different approaches country, how to collaborate with different approach of industry. So again, the collaboration with is necessary. So I think the collaboration and the technology innovation, that is a key feature of the Japanese green transformation policy.
Thank you very much. And that really leads us very smoothly on to our final speaker, because as you've reminded us, Takashi, there was a pre-existing commitment by the former government to the green transformation strategy, net zero featured principally within that. And this is likely to be continued by the new administration, which is very good news. And of course, despite what happens in the United States, there are still efforts to create the regional commitment through these new platforms for net zero to be the guiding policy for the economic transformation. Now, you ended on the importance of international cooperation. And on that note, I'd like to bring you in, Miranda. So, of course, you've been doing quite a lot of work on this through the British Chamber of Commerce. And I know that the concept of green tech equity is something that you've been promoting. And in short, it is about ensuring, going back to Nick's point, that those countries that have not been able to benefit from the green economy, creating it through financial impediments to others, this is something that you've got an answer for.
A proposed answer for, let's say. No, I think the things you've heard today really have hung together very well. So I run one of the chambers of commerce in the north of England, in Lancashire, and I represent the British Chambers of Commerce on their international climate dealings. And we have a delegation with us here today, arriving over the next few days. And they come for two reasons. They come because either they are considering themselves to be leaders in decarbonisation and driving their businesses forward, or they are innovators. They are people developing new technologies and seeing how they can get those technologies taken forward and supported. And you've given a subtitle to today's event, what's the role of members of parliament in creating an enabling environment for net zero? And that's exactly where this whole technology support needs to come in, that we've very handily all referenced. So we work with a whole range of businesses with late stage innovation, funding, but especially that gap that isn't there, where to support people through the area they call the valley of death. It's very good. It's very easy to sort of get support to innovate your technology. It's very hard to get funding to actually take it all the way through to manufacture. So here this week we've got with us people who are manufacturing heat pumps, retrofitting houses and businesses, looking at latex recycling. We've got a company who is getting an MOU signed for carbon capture, utilization and storage with an Azerbaijan funding organization. But then you say, why are they coming here for that funding? And that's because the funding and support locally in our individual countries isn't easy, sort of considering an easy enough route for the risk of low carbon technology commercialization. We're not seeing those patient capital funds. We're not seeing those large funding streams actually be prepared to take the risk to work on those new technologies. And that's holding them back. That's holding us back from deploying them. So in the UK, like you say, 70% of the world, we have a new government at the moment, and they're making the right noises. You know, they're creating things like the National Wealth Fund and GB Energy, and talking about these being mechanisms where we will see investment go in for economic return, and saying, well, we will create an environment of certainty. As you say, businesses cannot co-invest with government if there isn't an environment of certainty. But we've got to then look at how we take that forward globally. We've got to make sure we're enabling those technologies to develop locally, but then we're actually delivering globally. Because if those technologies aren't supported to end up in those countries which are still developing their energy systems, how can we say to a country which has got a really hefty amount of potential carbon energy intense energy sources, who are sitting on top of oil and gas, and how can we say to them, you can't use that to develop unless we can help support them have the technologies to bypass that process? And that's where this theory of green tech equity comes in. And it's playing off the fact that during the COVID crisis, we created what we called, probably a little ineptly, but vaccine equity, where the vaccines were initially being developed in some of the more affluent areas of the world, but then there was a way of getting them into countries which couldn't immediately afford that development, and protecting the IP of the developers, but then also looking to start the manufacture of those vaccines in the countries around the world, creating an economic benefit. And we need to do the same with green technologies. It's not good enough just to develop them in the UK and Japan and in Germany. We need to actually make sure those technologies are deployed without a debt burden globally. And we need the finance to be bold enough to do that. And we need the politicians to be able to decide that that's the right thing to do for the globe.
That's indeed it. And you brought us full circle back to why we're having this discussion in the Parliamentary Pavilion. Because now in particular, since, Vivian, I think it was you who mentioned the agreement on Article 6.4. Now we have clarity on what the rules would be guiding the carbon markets. It's for legislators to come to step up and identify what would be the enabling rules, policies and measures that need to be legislated, made mandatory in their particular context. So on that, I'd like to open the floor for any questions. We don't have very long, but for those of you, you've heard what the panel has to say in terms of the trajectory of net zero, which countries are leading, what's needed now. So let's see if there are any questions, comments. Otherwise, let me get back to you. So, Nick, we don't have that much longer, but you kicked off this conversation, and you've been following really closely where the discussions are within some of the leading groups within the negotiation process. So what would your advice be to parliamentarians who are here, obviously from many different geographies, but all facing the same conundrum, whether it's creating those cooperative relationships with a Japan or with a United Kingdom? What's the sweet spot that you would identify for them?
COPs can be very confusing. This one is, in a sense, less confusing because there's one big item on the agenda, which is finance, but it's also linked to mitigation. So the two things for me is, one, let's not forget that next year we have to set the mitigation goals in countries, but that's the same as setting our investment goals and our technology goals. And if we want business to invest against a target, we've got to have ambition, and sometimes it feels like people are forgetting that there's those two sides of the same coin. So parliamentarians need to send the message and take home that having a ambiguous NDC, one with lots of caveats and lots of conditionalities, is not actually helpful in driving investment to your country or sending a signal that your country is open for business to investors who will have lots of other countries coming to go there. So if you look at the NDC as a burden, it's one thing. If you look at it as a signal, it's another thing. And the second piece for me would be, there'll be a lot of discussion about finance and particularly the public finance goals. And obviously the US saying it's going to leave Paris is going to make it's a less ambitious finance COP. I mean, there's a big country who's a donor is not going to be in the room, which means even more we have to use the money we have much more effectively. And so the other part of the finance goal is to send a signal. We have to reform our whole finance system to reduce the cost of capital to developing countries in particular by having better risk ratings, better guarantee systems, better markets. There's an awful lot of reform needed out there, but that needs all countries to agree for reform. And this COP and then the goal itself can send a signal that we need to carry on, like we do with NDCs, coming back and back and back to drive reform in these global systems so that everybody gets a fair go at getting capital. Not they get it for free, not they're getting a handout, but if they do the job, they will get flows because their risk will be assessed accurately. They won't be discriminated against because of where they are in the world. They'll get a response to what they're doing. And I think parliamentarians can make that case because there's a danger we go to a low ambition outcome focusing on old arguments where it should be, no, let's create the systems we need to really make this work, both in ambition and in finance.
Thank you. And you made the important point about the value of the NDCs, seeing them as not just yet another set of goals, but as investment opportunities. And that's something that we're going to come back to again and again in our discussion about NDCs 3.0, because for the first time, these are covering the whole of economies. They're not just one particular part of the world, they're universal. I saw that, Takashi, do you want to come in on this point about on NDC specifically? Yeah, so go ahead, please.
As I mentioned, I work for the industry. That means I am a practitioner. So I think that for policy and the NDC, two types of approach could be possible. One is a best solution, and the other is a practical solution. So from the industry point of view, practical solution is better because if we are making effort or making best effort, that the goal we can reach to that goal, that is a good goal for industry. If the goal is too far away from the position, a place we can reach to, that is not good. So if I can provide advice or suggestion to the policy people, so a kind of practicality is necessary. In that case, so I recommend to having a kind of the dialogue between the policy side and industry side. What is the best phrase? So if easy goal, that is not good. But to follow away, that is not good. So dialogue, I think the policy people can find out the best phrase to setting a goal. That is my suggestion.
I think that any lawmaker in the room would be very happy with that because they have to be voted back in the next time round. Yeah. So pragmatic opportunity is very much what's also emphasized by the presidency with this slogan of theirs to enhance ambition, but to enable action. So on that note, Vivian, you've been waiting very patiently from Singapore. So I'm going to offer you the last thoughts before we wrap this particular session up.
So I concur with what, thank you. So I concur with what Nick and, well, all the panelists have said with respect to essentially aligning interests. If we take, again, if we take note from how the US has structured its IRA, so the benefits are broad and there is, and also the way it's structured has been, quite intelligent. So it is not going to be, so the benefits that the IRA offers will continue regardless of who is in the White House because of the broad-based benefits it brings. And so that, I think, is helpful for parliamentarians. One, by ensuring that your people benefit broadly, not just a very small group. It helps your election chances, obviously. It also helps your legacy as a parliamentarian. And so, very consciously ensuring these benefits are key. Now, the NDCs as a signal, as Nick said, as a signal and as a competitive governmental policy tool is certainly essential. So I hope and I recommend that governments proceed with ambition while optimizing the green growth and net zero goals.
Thank you very much.
And all the best in negotiations.
Thanks very much, Vivian. We do have colleagues in the room also who work on climate legislation, the next generation of climate legislation. And this is a very, very directly relevant discussion for us because in a couple of days, we're going to be launching a statement looking at the next generation of climate change laws. And what we're actually seeing is that the meaning and the intent of climate change legislation is being reshaped by the way in which the real economy has been reshaped by the adoption of net zero commitments. So on that, I take your point very strongly that the IRA is a politically neutral piece of legislation. It's very pragmatic. It is disarmingly neutral because it says nothing about climate. And so it is unthreatening, and it is indeed a piece of legislation that should be studied by other parts of the world to see how this next generation of climate change legislation can actually be much more economically better informed so that the benefits flow to the bulk of the population who we need to make sure are protected and benefited from climate leadership. So on that note...
Malini?
Yes? You want to come
back in? If I may add one more point.
Okay.
Yes, just very briefly, because it's pertinent to the state of the world and the state of pop. So my apologies for not adding it earlier. We can proceed on net zero goals without mentioning the word climate if need be. That is obviously the need in a very important country for the next 4 years, possibly more. So again, it's going back to, why this matters. Aligning interests, and that is really important. So don't lose heart. The United States actually was able to reduce carbon emissions from 2016 to 2020. Of course, perhaps it could have reduced emissions even more if certain policies were taken.
Yeah.
But take heart.
Absolutely, and I have to mention that in the previous session we had where the focus was entirely on the implications of the U.S. elections for climate action. that it was the mayor from Ukraine who reminded us that their motto is, "In Trump we trust." Because they have to look forward, they have to be optimistic, there is no other option. So, not suggesting
I think
that's
Trump will like that logo.
He would. I'm not suggesting that there was unanimity around that. But the intent behind that is, of course, we have to look to the future. The train has left the station on this agenda. And we're going to be coming back to these themes during the course of the 2 weeks here at the Parliamentary Pavilion. But for today, thank you so much to Nick, to Miranda, to Takashi and Vivian, who's joined us from Singapore. And thank you to everyone who's joining us on the live stream and those who are here in the room today. Thanks a lot.